Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. I own a nice little farm just outside of town. It's nothing too fancy, just a cozy house with some barns and a big open field where my animals can wander and graze. I enjoy the peace and quiet out here. My closest neighbor is old Jim, who lives about a mile down the road. He's a nice fellow who minds his own business. The only other neighbor I have to worry about is Karen, who moved in across the street last year. From the moment she moved in, I could tell Karen was going to be a pain. She complained about every little thing: the rooster crowing too early, the smell from the pigs, all kinds of nonsense. I tried to be polite and explain that this is just normal farm life, but she wouldn't have any of it. A few months after she moved in, I started noticing Karen having a lot of company. Fancy cars with out-of-state plates would come rolling up her driveway one after another. Then I started seeing reservation papers taped to her front door for something called the Brown Family Reunion. Uh-oh, I thought, this doesn't sound good. Sure enough, a couple weeks later I woke up early in the morning to the sound of vehicles rumbling down the road. I looked out my window to see a caravan of RVs turning into my driveway. By the time I got dressed and went outside, there were already 15 campers parked in my field. I walked over to the first one and knocked on the door. A middle-aged guy wearing cargo shorts and tall socks opened up. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Is this where we're supposed to park?" I explained to him that this was my private property, and I had not given anyone permission to park here. I pointed across the street to Karen's place and said that's probably where they were supposed to be. The guy was very apologetic. He said Karen told them all that the big open field was part of her property, and it was fine for them to park there. I thanked him for being so understanding and asked him to kindly move his RV across the street. After speaking with the first guest, I went down the line, knocking on doors, repeating the same story about 20 times. Everyone was very nice about it and agreed to move over to Karen's place. I even helped guide some of the bigger rigs across the street. By the time I finished moving the last camper, 5 more had shown up. I told them the same thing I had told the others, but at this point, Karen came storming over, yelling at me to leave her family alone. I tried to explain to her that she can't just invite 20 RVs to park on my private property without permission. Karen wasn't having it. She claimed that I obviously wasn't using the field, so what's the big deal if her family parks there for a few days? I told Karen in no uncertain terms that everyone had to clear off my land immediately. Karen folded her arms and refused, saying I was ruining her family reunion over nothing. At this point, some of her relatives started wandering over, wanting to know what the heck was going on. Despite Karen's objections, I informed her family that she had misled them about having permission to camp on my field. I said I would be happy to let them stay if Karen wanted to pay me a fair price for the week. Well, that set Karen off big time. She started ranting and raving about how I was extorting her family. I stood my ground and said it was only fair that I be compensated if she wants them to use my land. Karen continued to scream at me until one of her brothers stepped in and said they would be happy to pay a reasonable fee. I gave him my number and told him to have Karen call me so we could work out a price. The brother corralled Karen away, and gradually her angry screaming faded into the distance. I saw RV after RV exiting my property and lining up along the street in front of Karen's house. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Karen's brother Steve. He apologized profusely on behalf of his sister and asked how much I wanted for them to park in my field for the week. I quoted him a very reasonable price of $20 per RV per night. Steve said that sounded fair and he would gather up the money from everyone. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked into my mailbox. I opened it up expecting to find a nice check for $1,400, the amount we had agreed upon. Instead, there was just a nasty note from Karen saying she wasn't paying me a dime, and if I had a problem with it, I could see her in court. I couldn't believe the nerve of this woman. I immediately called my lawyer and explained the situation. He advised me to send Karen a formal letter through certified mail stating she had 24 hours to pay up, or I would be filing a lawsuit for damages. The next day came and went without a peep from Karen. My lawyer then proceeded to file a claim against her in small claims court for $1,400 plus the filing fees. A few weeks later, we had our court date. Karen showed up dressed to the nines, clearly trying to impress the judge. She went on and on about how I was harassing her innocent family and trying to extort them for money. I simply presented my case. She had 20 RVs illegally parked on my property without permission for a full week. The judge agreed and ordered her to pay me the full $1,400 plus court fees, totaling $1,500. Karen was furious. As we left the courtroom, she got right up in my face and shouted that she hopes all my animals get loose and wreck my farm. I just smiled and said, "Have a nice day, Karen," before walking out. The next day, I had a cashier's check from Karen for $1,500. It felt great finally getting what I deserved after the major inconvenience she caused. I'm just glad I stood my ground and didn't let Karen intimidate me. She now avoids eye contact whenever I see her around town. Maybe next time she'll think twice before trying to take advantage of her neighbors. The next one is a pro-revenge story. This happened in the early 2000s when I joined a startup. We agreed on a salary and no paid overtime, with an evaluation in 3 months and then annually. Standard stuff mostly. It was a very mediocre salary for the work, but I really liked the work itself, which was extremely interesting and challenging. For me, even if the finances were so-so, I felt I'd learn a lot of skills that would be useful in the future. After 3 years and having 10 decent clients and a bunch of clients trialing, with money rolling in, the talk turned to back pay, paid overtime, and compensating for past overtime. At that point, around $50,000 in overtime had been accrued, which is a lot. Legally, it couldn't be back pay, so the talk was always of a discretionary bonus. Now at this point, everyone is okay with this, including myself, and this was discussed in writing via company emails too, so I felt secure and that no bad will was in play. I felt the company should be able to afford the payment. Equally, I'd happily settle for equity at a discount, which is legally possible there, if cash flow was an issue. The discussions about back pay, possible equity, and now started to drag on, and I was getting irked by this. In the end, I was made an offer of equity, which meant the company valuation was far beyond anything reasonable, in the hundreds of millions, and I'd get a minuscule stake, less than 0.01% of a company with 9 employees and a projected annual turnover of around $2 million. It was a sort of FU to stiff me out of money, and I didn't want to take that lying down. To say I was furious was an understatement. Anyway, the day he made that offer, I handed in my resignation. This sent the CTO into panic mode because the CEO had refused an updated contract, and I was still on a 1-month notice period. Plus, I had a lot of untaken paid leave. Basically, it meant I was walking out right then and there. So, off I went that very same day, to the shock and surprise of everyone, I guess. The next day, I sent an official registered letter requesting my overtime/back pay and received a negative response, which I followed up with another detailed demand. This was also rejected because the bonus was discretionary and there is no overtime. However, I'd been seeking legal advice and I understood that they don't have a leg to stand on if I am willing to pay for an attorney. As the liability in such matters is firmly and 100% on the employer, I was willing. You need to understand that going to a lawyer was very rare in those parts back then, so companies didn't generally expect this outcome. Things have since changed. When going through the applicable laws with the attorney, I noticed there is a limitation of 7 years. So while my attorney was laying out what to do to get me my money in as little as a few weeks, I just asked him, what if we wait until it's 6 years and 11 months after the transgression, and then file demanding interest? I wanted this because the law stated that back pay is due at a 9% APR above the base rate, 3.25% at that time, accrued daily for every day past the due date. We're looking at ~1212, 5% compound daily APR. The risk is that the company folds in that time, but I decided to take that risk. I sent one final letter stating that I expect all the owed and accrued amounts to date to be paid immediately. Of course, nothing happened. For the next few years, life rolled on. The company did grow and become a known player in the area. When the time came, I found an attorney and started the case. We had copies of all the communications, copies of the registered letters and responses. The back pay demanded now, including interest, was $112,000. What I didn't know was that in addition to this, there are fixed penalties for each instruction to perform uncompensated overtime. The total demand was something like $135,000. To say that the CEO, who was still CEO, lost his temper would be an understatement. I got a very verbally abusive phone call, which I dutifully recorded, as it wasn't completely unexpected, and was added to the filing. The CEO fought or tried to, but when the judge heard the phone call, he took an immediate dim view. Reading through all the communication just put more nails in the defense's coffin. The judge just ruled and instructed the company to pay immediately and without delay, and also ordered the company to pay all my legal costs. They also got a full audit from the Department of Labor. The company paid up a week later. To add insult to injury, the evening of the court's decision, the CEO apparently got very drunk and crashed his car into another vehicle while drunk. He got a DUI conviction and lost his driving license for half a year, and his insurance refused to pay out for the damages to his vehicle, brand new Mercedes S-Class, as he was drunk. All in all, a glorious day. The next one is a petty revenge story. We work for a national agricultural supply company, but I am in a central role while he flies frequently and therefore has lounge access with the airline. We were flying from one city back to our own. He was bragging about it the whole day, and when we got to the airport, he wished us peasants a nice time in the airport food court, slumming it with the mouth breathers and so on. He'd bruise his own tonsils if he could. That kind of bloke. Anyway, our flight nears, and he texts asking what the gate is. The rest of us are walking down the sky bridge onto the plane at this point. Now, this airport isn't exactly small. It's actually massive. We were getting on at gate 4. I told him we were at gate 44. We're laughing on the plane, imagining this bloke having to run through the terminal to catch it. Next minute, the doors on the plane lock and we're getting pushed back. That's when I thought I was in trouble. He'd complain, and the boss would throw the book at me. He texts, "Hey, where are you guys?" And I told him we're taxiing down the runway and that we tried holding the plane for him. And the bloke just explodes. I put my phone on airplane mode and breathe out. When we land, he's blown up my phone, and I've got a missed call from my boss. I call my boss back and say I accidentally pushed 4 twice, and he just laughed and reckons he would have paid big money to see old mate's meltdown. Anyway, it ruined his day. He had to pay for his own ticket home, and now I think my life is in danger. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So I went to a famous Portuguese chicken chain restaurant takeaway. They are known for making deliveries in my area, especially during the COVID-19 outbreak. My grandparents live alone and aren't receiving any visitors due to the outbreak. Now I was close to the restaurant, and I wanted to order a meal for my grandparents without having to go to their house, because that would involve physically meeting them, whereas the restaurant delivery would adhere to strict COVID-19 prevention measures. At the restaurant, I placed my order and asked for it to be delivered to their house. The robot-like cashier said that it wouldn't be possible to deliver food to a house when the customer orders the food at the restaurant. I thought it was a misunderstanding and made it clear that I would pay the full delivery charge, and that all that would change is the manner in which the food was ordered. I didn't want my grandparents to have to pay for the meal and also didn't want to meet them due to COVID-19. After pleading and a frustrating back and forth with the cashier, she raised her voice at me and said, "Sir, we only take delivery orders over the phone." Cue malicious compliance. With a wide smile on my face, I thanked her and stepped away from the till. I called the delivery number, only for her to answer the call right in front of me. I placed the entire order all over again while we stared at each other in what must have been humiliating for her. Her colleagues at this point all began staring and some started giggling. After placing the order, I once again went up to her and asked her to process the payment for the order I just placed. She, at this point, saw the silliness of the situation and let me pay just to be done with all this. Suffice to say, my grandparents managed to enjoy the chicken. The next one is an entitled people story. This was at the beginning of the pandemic, just before countries were beginning their lockdowns. The wife and I were visiting our families in our country of birth and had to rush back to our home country. The airline had canceled our pre-booked flights and rerouted us via 3 other flights across various countries. This also meant that the seats we had booked wouldn't be the ones we'd be getting. To say it was a nightmare of a journey wouldn't be an exaggeration. While the first flight was barely 3 hours, the second flight was 9 hours of being wedged between people in the center row after a 10-hour layover. With just another 15 hours until we reached home, a 5-hour layover plus the final 10-hour flight, we tried our best to just suck it up, despite not having slept for over a day. Our luck turned for the better on the final flight as we were assigned a window and middle seat. Seating configuration was 343. Upon boarding, we realized that the aisle seat beside mine was unoccupied. Overjoyed, I took the aisle seat while my wife took the window seat. We were barely able to keep our eyes open at this point and were looking forward to getting some sleep at last. All was going well until a mom boarded with two kids, Mem tilde 11, F tilde 7, in tow. We'd seen them at the airport and could tell this was their only flight, or at least their first. They were assigned the middle row of 4 seats between the 3 of them, just a few rows ahead of us. While putting their bags into the overhead bins, the mom was scanning the other seats and spotted the empty one between my wife and me. There was no way in hell either my wife or I were going to be seated next to some other person's child. Once the doors were closed and we were waiting to start the taxi stage, her son started loudly whining about wanting a window seat. In no time, the little brat started crying and demanding a window seat. The passengers around them were clearly annoyed at listening to a freaking 11-year-old throw a tantrum but were way too decent to say anything. Instead of telling her child to STFU, the mother encouraged the son to go ask passengers if they'd be willing to give up their seat, while turning around and looking at my wife and me. I woke my wife up to inform her of what to expect and told her to stand her ground if the lady asked. When the flight crew came by to check our seatbelts, they saw the woman standing up and told her to sit down and buckle up. We noticed her trying to say something to the attendant but couldn't hear what was being said. Once up in the air and the seatbelt signs were turned off, the mother once again stood up to look in our direction. But I made sure not to make any eye contact. By then, the kid had settled into his seat, but the mother was adamant about looking for some sucker to give up their window seat. Her plan was to get the son to sit somewhere else while she and her daughter could lay down comfortably across the 4 seats. Since that didn't work, she chose to keep glaring at me every time she got up to go to the toilet. At one point, I smiled at her and got an even worse stare. The next one is an entitled parent story. I, 19F, have lived with my mother all my life but moved out a year ago due to multiple traumatic events in the past. As of last week, I got the official PTSD diagnosis for this, and I plan to cut ties. She has never been the nurturing type and always just given me the bare minimum that I needed to survive. I'm talking my friends had to teach me at 13 or so how to brush my hair and teeth because my mom couldn't be arsed to do it. They also had to explain things you usually learn in preschool that my mom also failed to show me, like not to hit or even touch other kids if they didn't want it. She left me alone for the first time when I was 6, overnight, and when I called crying 20 minutes after she left, my mom said that she would only come home if there was an emergency, and I was so scared to be alone I almost threw myself down the stairs on purpose so that she would come home. I chickened out and cried myself to sleep. The next day she said, "See, that went well, no need to be a baby about it," and from that point forward just expected me to be okay with her dipping whenever she felt like it. She said I looked like a Chinese prostitute because I had makeup on for the first time and the shade was too pale for me. She said that all the men would be looking at me in that way, and that I would be a pretty sight distraction for them. I was 12, and I was about to go to church for a ceremony. She has repeatedly made it known that she doesn't care about my well-being nearly as much as my chores being done, my grades being good, and people think she's a good, brave single mom, from not caring that I wouldn't eat or show up at her house for days, just to see if that would make her worry to calling me fat even though I'm perfectly healthy, and she is the obese one. There is a lot to unpack here. I'm going to therapy and I'm getting better. Responsible for my PTSD is something she did when I was 6 or 7. She would invite our neighbor and her 2 sons over so they could play with me, and the grown-ups would talk. Those 2 boys SAE'd me multiple times during those play dates. I begged my mom not to let them come over again with tears in my eyes. She responded by saying I should be grateful those older boys were even indulging me. After all, boys that age don't want to play with girls, much less younger babies like myself. It stopped after she fought with the neighbor. Meanwhile, my memories got repressed, and I only remembered these things after 2 years of therapy. That was just the context. Sorry for trauma dumping. My birth-giver's most recent escapade is this. Ever since my grandma, her and my aunt's mother, died, my aunt doesn't celebrate Christmas with my mother. She says it's because she thinks the holiday is overrated, but whenever I come to visit on December 24th, or 25, to drop off presents, the entire house is decorated beautifully, and I'm always invited to stay for dinner, a movie, or a snack. I think my aunt likes to celebrate Christmas, just not with her sister. My sister, the golden child and an enabler for my mother's tantrums, spends one holiday with our mother and one with her baby daddy's family so the kids get even visits. So imagine my surprise when after a year of little to no contact, suddenly I'm called by Mother Dearest, asking me to come home and spend Christmas with family. I have been at my dad's for Christmas for 5 years in a row. I was the first to leave to spend the holiday elsewhere, then came my aunt, and then this year my sister. Why I should throw around my plans because she failed to keep her family close literally every other day of the year is beyond me, and I tell her so. Now, of course, this is very sad, and I'm a horrible daughter/person for doing this, and leaving my poor mother alone on Christmas. Boo-hoo. Some family members have called and told me to not be selfish, and it's the time for family to come together. I tell them I am with my family. And if they think it's so sad that this poor, narcissistic, abusive she-devil has to spend a cold December night alone, then they can come and pick her up. No one wants to do that. Big surprise! My aunt is staying out of it. My dad says it's my right to do whatever I want on Christmas, and would not recommend going back out of pity and guilt. My mom is crying and calling and guilt-tripping me and begging me to come home. My sister says I'm being cruel and a selfish brat. The woman is my mom and she gave birth to me. Our family is really small, so there are like 7 people on either side. Can someone please tell me I'm not insane? I think I need to hear that, or would you keep someone like this in your life? Aside from the essay, this is the tamer stuff she did. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.